thank you to be here and to attend this conference. This conference will talk about safety standards in laboratories. So, and the topic is risk or opportunity. You will understand why I called it risk or opportunity, because depending on the point of view, customer, manufacturers, or safety organization, the way to consider standards is very, very different. Few words about myself for the one who doesn't know me. So my name is Cédric Herry. I'm French, located in France, in Normandy. I obtained my PhD in chemistry and microbiology end of the last century, and joined Lab in 2001. So I first started as R&D manager, became later R&D director, and now I am VP at Lab. That said, I'm also chairman of the French Standardization Committee for Laboratory Ventilation. This standardization committee is called UNM 61. It's also called the French Mirror Group of the European Committee, where I am expert. And the European Committee for Laboratory Ventilation Fume Cup Board is called WG4TC 332 of the European Normalization Organization. So, and that's based on this experience, both at a lab and at standardization committees, that I will share my experience today. First of all, I would like to show you this definition. So this is a summary of the definition given by European organization, where it is defined that a standard is a document that establishes rules, guidelines, or characteristics for activities or their results. So it can be about a product, it can be about a service, or it can be about an organization. Most of the time, standards, or all the time, standards are written and established sitting together with manufacturers, experts, safety organization, users. So the idea is to share all the point of view together and to find the best compromise to define a topic altogether. This is said by CER. It is supposed to benefit to everyone, and that's the idea. Normally, at the end, a standard should benefit to manufacturer, but at the same time should benefit to the end user. This is a key component for a single European market, but I would say also, not starting from the European point of view, but from the global point of view. At the ISO level, it is set to define a global market with the same rules and the same level of knowledge. And it is crucial to facilitate the trades between customers and users, and also between countries to other countries. It codifies best practices, and it is usually states of the art. Usually states of the art, but not always. Sometimes also standards can define requirements that are above the state of the art in order to improve innovation. This is very typical for car industry. When they set standards for the car pollution, they always set a level that cannot be reached by the manufacturer, with the idea that the manufacturer will innovate to reach this target years after the publication of the standard. If you go to CN website, you will also see on their definition that somewhere in the page they wrote that a standard is boring. oh my God, a standard is boring. That's a little bit true. If you try to read a standard and what's inside, that's probably not the best literature you can find on the market. And I would say the bad side of standards is most of the time it's considered to be boring, to all annoying, but also for manufacturers and customers, it can be considered, sorry for the expression, that's the only one I know in English, as pain in the ass. It's something that 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 creates a kind of challenge for the industry, and that can make the market a little bit more complicated. That's true and not true at the same time. Today, I will try to give you information to consider standards a little bit less boring than expected. There is also something to consider. There is some standard objectives. So I found this information on the French website of AFNOR. When we consider standards, we've got different goals. The first one is to improve production efficiency. A very good example, if you consider ISO 9001 or 14001, both standards that are called quality management and environmental management, if I'm true, are both written not to improve quality or not to improve environment. They are both written and established to improve manufacturing efficiency or service efficiency. So the second objective that was clearly defined in the slide before is to make the exchange and deals easier. Sometimes it's very, very difficult to establish a technical requirement between a manufacturer and a customer. If you try to define what you expect from a BSC, it can be a long a document. And the standard is here to make the description of the technical requirement easier. That's a good example on how a standard can make exchange and deals easier. As also explained in the slide before, standards can sometimes be used to accelerate innovation or to develop new product service development. That's very true when you talk about IT standards. Sometimes they establish new IT rules or new IT procedure that then will be used by everybody in the world. It's also used sometimes to allow technological transfer. That sometimes, if you want that the technology benefits to all the industry, instead of publishing a patent, it can be a good idea to write a standard. And it provides progress to final user organization. And I've got to say that most of the time it's not well understood by final user organization or manufacturers. Here, what I would like to show you is that standards can come from every level in the world. First of all, each country can establish its own standard. That's the example in Europe with AFNOR that establishes standards for France, DIN for Germany, BSI for UK. And just above, there is a continental level with CEN. In Europe, CEN established standard for all the countries of Europe and a little bit more. Also, Turkey also is part of CEN, or Switzerland is part of CEN. And at the highest level, you've got also international standardization committee with ISO, UPAC, or CEI. There is a kind of global agreement that tells that if a standard is established at the highest level, it's then translated to the continental level and to the national one. That means that all CEN standards are then transferred to national level. The reverse is not true. Standard that is first established at the AFNOR level will not become a European standard. So that's something to understand too. And there is an agreement if a standard is or a committee is established at the European level, the national countries cannot work on it independently. There is different type of standards as defined by CEN. As said before, first of all, you've got some fundamental standards which concerns terminology, convention, signs, or symbol. That's something you can find with the UPAC system as example. The second type of standards are the test methods and analysis standards. And that's probably where came my first question about standards years ago. When I was a student, I've studied environmental engineering, and most of the time the people ask you, does this water comply to standards? And I checked myself on the web, what are the standards for water? And I just found standards about quality control, or to test COD, or to test GELDAL, or things like that. But in the standard, there is no information about the level of quality you've got to reach, because level of quality, the threshold for quality, water quality are established in the law, not at the standard level. But these standards for analysis and test methods are very, very useful for laboratories. Then you've got specification standards that applies to products or services. And then in that type of specification, you've got two types of specification. You can have a specification about the level of performance you've got to reach with an equipment, or you can have a standard that establishes the way to design an equipment. That's something that is defined at the beginning when you write a standard. And the last one, you've got organization standards, and a good example of organization standards are ISO 9000 and 14000 series. Okay, here what I would like to show you is another kind of typical misunderstanding. On the products that or services that deliver to a user, you can find some marks. So the one we find the most generally in Europe is a CE marked. CE marked does not mean that you comply to standards. CE marked means that a product delivered in Europe complies to the regulation. And I would say that all the products delivered in Europe must comply to the European regulation. And that's up to the European manufacturer or the dealers in Europe to check if the product or the service they deliver in Europe complies to the CE regulation. Be careful, because the CE compliance must be associated to a mark that is showed here on the slide. You can see on the left the European conformity mark, and there is a kind of conflict with the China export mark. So when you buy a product with a CE mark, be careful and check if it's really a European conformity and not a China export mark. In France, we've got also the NF mark, and there is other kind of mark you've got in Germany. NF is also NF is also linked to regulation. And in Germany and in the US or in Europe, you've got also the TÜV, UL, and ETL, and they are, I'd say, private trademark. UL is a very specific private trademark, very recognized in the US, but at the same time, UL by itself is not so low and it's not mandatory. By contrast with C mark as an example. Few words about the link between the C mark and European standardization. Most of the time, standards in Europe are not mandatory. A manufacturer or a customer can decide to comply or not to a standard. And you do not decide if you want to comply to C because it's mandatory. But in order to prove your compliance to CE, there is a way to use a certain kind of standards that are called harmonized standards that are linked to the European regulation. And this specific standard called harmonized standard, and they do not represent more than 5% of the standards in Europe, are mandatory. Now, more specifically about laboratories. In laboratories, you can face a lot of standards that are linked to your safety. One example is the one about clean rooms, a very typical one, the ISO 14644 for clean rooms. This is a standard that was first established at the ISO levels, at the international level, and then transcribed into a European one, or and then in a French one, a British one, and a German one or Spanish one, whatever. For safety equipment, for BSCs, in Europe, we've got the EN 12469, and in the US, we've got the NSF, sorry, there is a plane just passing. Sorry for the disturbance. Okay. Concerning BSCs, biological safety cabinet, there is two specific standards. One in Europe, the EN 12669, and in the US, the NSF 149. And they are typical product specification standards. Another product specification standards, but that is also at the same time a test method standard, is a EN 14175 that applies to fume cupboards. And for the same product called fume hoods in the US, they've got the ASHRAE 110. I will not talk about the ISO, the quality management, environmental management. There is also in the US standards about lab ventilation, and in France and in the UK, standards about recirculatory filtration fume cupboards, the NFX 15 to 11 in France, and the BS 7989 in the UK. Now, what I will do, I will give you two examples of what is contained in this standard and what you can expect from this standard, knowing how it is structured. My first example is probably the most complex one. It's the EN 14175 that applies to fume hoods. First of all, the first thing to understand is that EN 14175 is not one standard, but a series of standards from EN 14175 Part 1 to Part 7. And probably next year will be published the Part 8 for FUMUTs for radioisotope or radio nuclide. Sorry for the accent. So each part of the standards is specific to one topic. The first one explains the vocabulary specific to FUMUTs. An example, it defines what the enclosure is, what the airflow is, etc., etc. The second one seems to be the most important one, but in fact, when you study the content of this standard, it's not very stringent. The second one, the part 2, is about safety and performance requirements. The part 3 and the part 4 are 100% for test method for on-site testing and type testing for FUMUTs. The part 7 is a technical specification with recommendation about the installation and maintenance of this kind of equipment. Part 6 is another type test method specific for VAV FUMUTs, and the part 7 is the specific part for test method for FUMUTs for thermal and acid thermal load and high acid use. As said before, in the part 2, when you just check the title, you can expect a long list of requirements for FUMUT, but in fact, there is a short list of requirements specific for the fume cupboard construction, the sash safety, or some requirements for the visible and audible alarms, specifically for the flow monitoring. But at the same time, if you consider that a FUMUT protects you thanks to the ability to contain pollution in the enclosure, there is a kind of misunderstanding, because in this part of the standard, there is no requirements about phase velocity, there is no requirements about containment threshold, and there is no requirements about robustness of containment. The part 3 is type test. It explains to manufacturer and test company how to perform a type test on fume cupboard. And this one is very complete. There is a long list of procedure on how to test phase velocity, inner grid containment procedure, outer grid containment procedure, robustness of containment. But this is 100% a description of methods and procedure to test some parameters, and there is no information about the threshold limits to apply to each of these parameters. If you think about my example about water quality control, that was exactly the same 20 years ago. When I measured water quality in the standard, I was able to find the procedure, but no value to reach in the procedure. The part 4, and if we consider part 4 and to part 7, there are some kind of variation of the part 3, except the part 5 that is more specific about the way to properly install and control fume cupboard. Oh, sorry, there is a mistake on my slide. I will just, it's, non, c'était bon. No, sorry, it was correct. So now if we just consider EN 14175, we've got just to consider that it includes a complete description of what a fume cupboard is. The definition is perfectly correct, and this is very useful, because if you've got to write a technical requirements and to ask to your manufacturer what you're looking for, yes, you've got to ask a fume cup board according to the definition given in EN 14175 Part 1. It also lists minimum requirements for the fume cup board, about the sash motion, about the alarm, and all these requirements are useful for the technical requirements. But at the same time, there is a lack of threshold for both containment and phase velocity. So if you just ask to your supplier to provide you a fume cup board complying to EN 14175, there is no guarantee of minimum phase velocity or no guarantee of minimum containment. For these requirements, you've got to check other documents than EN 14175. It also gives advice about how correctly install fume cup boards, list instructions for marking and documentation. So it means that all fume cup board that complies to EN 14175 must be marked according to this standard and must be provided with a complete documentation according to this standard. And I also recommend you to ask to your manufacturer to ask them containment test report or phase velocity reports. Okay, I will come back to the slide before to be sure that this is a slide I previously showed to you. You can see that for EN 14175, there is no way to find any pass or fail criteria or threshold limit in the standards, and there is no information about usage and maintenance of fume cup board, but you've got all the information about definition, type test procedure, marking, and documentation. And for EN 12469, you've got all the information about definition, type test procedure, on-site tests, pass and fail criteria, marking and documentation, but no information about usage and maintenance guidance. And NFX 15211, you've got definition, type test procedure, pass and fail criteria, marking and documentation, but a lack of information about on-site testing and usage and maintenance. And to go back to the other slide, here on this chart, you can see that the different values published in Europe. So containment in the internal plan in France, according to NFX 15211, the values established by BG Chemie in Germany in the outer grid, in Netherlands, the guideline, and in Sweden, the phase velocity. So to conclude this presentation, so first of all, I would say that standards are useful. There is no doubt about that. That's easier to use a standard and to require to comply to a standard than rewriting all the technical requirement or test procedure for a product. But at the same time, you must be aware that everything is not defined in the standard. And before using a standard, it's very, very important to check what's inside. It's also very important to understand the purpose of the standard. Is it a test procedure standard? Is it a product requirement standard? Complying to the standard can include performing the test, respecting threshold limits, but also complying to marking and documentation. Never forget that. Depending on the standard, it can cover everything. And when you ask a customer to comply a standard, please ask them to provide you the proof of compliance, requiring the marking, the documentation, or the test report of the product. And the last information I would like to share with you is that, yes, fulfilling a standard is important, but it's never enough. And the most important part for a safety equipment such as a fume hood, a BSC, or recirculatory fume cup board is a risk assessment, and risk assessment is never including in the standard. Never forget to perform your risk assessment independently of the choice of the material. I do not have all the information on mind. I will recheck and will be sure that I will send you the information. But for sure, the first information is the reference to the standard itself. So it means that on the sticker, you must find a reference to EN 14175 or to NFX 15211. And then each standard will list exactly some kind of parameters that must be displayed. If I remember well, I don't know if it's in the documentation or on the sticker, but the containment factor must be displayed somewhere.